It was a single sentence that ended a career. In June 1971, the most decorated colonel in the United States Army sat down in front of an ABC television camera somewhere in the jungles of South Vietnam, looked directly into the lens, and said 7 words that the Pentagon would never forgive. "This is a bad war. It can't be won. We need to get out." Colonel David Hackworth had spent almost 5 years in Vietnam. He had 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 10 Silver Stars, 8 Purple Hearts. General Crichton Abrams, the man commanding every American soldier in the theater, had called him the best battalion commander he had ever seen in the United States Army. And now Hackworth was throwing it all away, not because he was a coward, not because he had lost his nerve, because he had watched 118 American soldiers walk into a jungle ambush, smelling like department stores and walking like tourists, while 4 Australians moved through the same jungle like they had been born in it, because he had seen what worked and what did not, because the men who taught him the truth about this war wore sandals cut from tire rubber and hadn't bathed in weeks, and because nobody at the Pentagon wanted to hear about it. What David Hackworth did after that broadcast would change everything. He didn't just criticize American tactics. He didn't just demand reform. He moved to Australia. He lived among the people whose soldiers had humiliated the most powerful military on earth. And for the rest of his life, in book after book, interview after interview, column after column, he said the same thing about the Australian way of war. 3 words that carried more weight than any medal. They earned that. This is the story of how those 3 words came to be, and why the man who spoke them had to destroy his own career to say them. To understand David Hackworth, you have to understand what made him. He was born on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1930, in Ocean Park, California. Both his parents were dead before he turned 1. His grandmother raised him on stories of the Old West and the Revolutionary War, feeding him on government assistance during the Depression, while planting in his mind the idea that soldiering was the highest calling a man could answer. At 14, lying about his age, he joined the Merchant Marine. At 15, he enlisted in the United States Army. The recruiting sergeant never checked. America had just finished a world war and wasn't particularly careful about who it let in the door. By the time Korea erupted in 1950, Hackworth was ready. He landed just in time for the Chinese onslaught that nearly pushed the United Nations forces off the peninsula entirely. Over 2 tours, he earned 3 Silver Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, and a battlefield commission that made him, at 21, the youngest captain in the United States Army during the Korean War. He fought in the brutal cold of Korean winters, led men through ambushes and counterattacks, and developed an instinct for combat that would define everything he did afterward. Korea taught him something fundamental. The textbooks were wrong. The doctrine was wrong. The generals who sat in heated headquarters drawing arrows on maps were wrong. The only truth in warfare was what happened on the ground, between the men who pulled triggers. He left the army briefly after Korea, found civilian life unbearable, and came back within 2 years. The army was the only family he had ever known, the only structure that made sense to a man who had been orphaned before he could walk. He spent the late 1950s in Germany during the Cold War, initially in staff positions before returning to the infantry as a company commander under Colonel Glover S. Johns. He served through the Berlin crisis of 1961, standing watch as the wall went up and Soviet armor lined the checkpoints, learning the stare-down diplomacy of the nuclear age. He earned a bachelor's degree in history from Austin Peay State University, attended the Command and General Staff College, and read voraciously about guerrilla warfare. He studied Mao Zedong's writings on insurgency. He read about the French disaster at Dien Bien Phu. He absorbed the lessons of the Malayan Emergency, where British and Australian forces had defeated a communist insurgency through patient, methodical counterinsurgency rather than overwhelming firepower. Every lesson pointed in the same direction. Small wars demanded small unit tactics, patience, and adaptation. The conventional military playbook was a recipe for failure against an enemy who refused to fight conventionally. When President Kennedy announced the advisory mission to Vietnam, Hackworth volunteered immediately. He was turned down for being overqualified. The Army didn't want experienced combat officers advising the South Vietnamese. It wanted technicians and administrators. Hackworth spent 3 years waiting, lobbying, and pestering anyone with the authority to send him to the war he knew was coming. It took until 1965 before the Army finally relented and sent him to war again. He arrived as a major with the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, and immediately recognized that the war being fought bore no resemblance to the war being described in official reports. American units were moving through triple canopy jungle in company and battalion strength, making enough noise to announce their presence from a kilometer away. The Viet Cong heard them coming every time. The ambushes were predictable. The casualties were mounting, and the response from higher command was always the same: more firepower, more helicopters, more artillery, more bombs. In November 1965, Hackworth created Tiger Force, a platoon-sized unit within the 101st designed to fight guerrillas using guerrilla tactics. The concept was simple and radical. Instead of crashing through the jungle with overwhelming force, small teams would move quietly, set ambushes, and fight the enemy on the enemy's terms. Hackworth called the approach out-G'ing the G. Out-guerrilla-ing the guerrilla. The unit earned the Presidential Unit citation. It was one of the first successful applications of unconventional tactics by American forces in Vietnam. But it was only a beginning. Between his first and second tours, Hackworth collaborated with the military historian General S.L.A. Slam Marshall to write the Vietnam Primer, a tactical handbook that challenged virtually every assumption the American military held about how to fight in Southeast Asia. The book argued for smaller units, better training, and tactics adapted to the jungle environment rather than imported from European battlefields. It sold well. It was widely read. It changed almost nothing at the institutional level. In January 1969, Hackworth returned for his most consequential tour. The Army gave him the 4th Battalion, 39th Infantry Regiment, a unit so demoralized and broken that it was known across the 9th Infantry Division as the worst fighting battalion in Vietnam. In the 6 months before Hackworth took command, the battalion had suffered over 600 casualties, almost entirely from mines and booby traps. The men had never effectively engaged the enemy. Morale was non-existent. Some soldiers had allegedly put a bounty on Hackworth's head before he even arrived, assuming he was another glory-seeking lifer who would get them killed faster. What happened next became legend. Within 10 weeks, Hackworth transformed the 4th Battalion into the Hardcore Recommandos, a unit that fought with a ferocity and effectiveness that stunned the division. His methods were unorthodox, bordering on heretical. He threw away the conventional playbook entirely. He broke his battalion into small, decentralized units operating independently across a 50-kilometer area of operations. He emphasized ambush over assault, patience over aggression, cunning over brute force. He trained his soldiers to move at night with the same confidence the Viet Cong displayed. He made alertness the cardinal virtue and discouraged dependence on technology. And here was the detail that connected everything that came before to everything that came after. Hackworth sent his company commanders to train with Australian infantry companies for 4 weeks. He didn't send them to Fort Benning. He didn't send them to the Army's own schools. He sent them to the Australians, because the Australians, in Hackworth's assessment, were the finest jungle fighters in the world. The Australian military presence in Vietnam had never been large. At peak strength, Australia deployed roughly 7,672 combat troops, a fraction of the American commitment of over 500,000. The first Australian advisors arrived in 1962, 30 men from the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, led by Colonel Ted Sarong, who had trained jungle warfare specialists during the Malayan emergency. They brought with them something the Americans did not possess: decades of institutional knowledge about fighting insurgents in dense tropical terrain. The Malayan emergency, which ran from 1948 to 1960, had given the Australian military a postgraduate education in counterinsurgency. They had learned from the British, from their own mistakes, and from the jungle itself. The campaign against communist guerrillas in the Malayan Peninsula had lasted 12 years and produced a body of tactical knowledge that was written into Australian military DNA. The lessons were specific and hard-won. Large unit operations drove the enemy deeper into the jungle without eliminating him. Artillery and airstrikes destroyed property and alienated the population without killing guerrillas who had learned to disperse before the ordnance arrived. The methods that worked were the opposite of what conventional military thinking prescribed. Small patrols of highly trained soldiers operating independently for extended periods, gathering intelligence through direct observation, ambushing enemy supply lines, and winning the support of the indigenous population through restraint rather than force. These were the techniques that broke the back of the Malayan insurgency, and these were the techniques that Australian soldiers carried to Vietnam. The United States Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, had freely admitted at an UNZUS meeting in Canberra in May 1962 that the U.S. Armed Forces knew little about jungle warfare. Given the experience Australian forces had gained in Malaya, it was felt that Australia could contribute by providing advisors who were experts in the tactics of jungle warfare. The first 30 advisors of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, led by Colonel Ted Sarong, arrived in South Vietnam during July and August 1962. They were among the most experienced counterinsurgency specialists in any Western military. Many had served in Malaya. Some had served in Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation. They understood, from years of practical application, principles that American doctrine had never seriously considered: small unit tactics, patient patrolling, the critical importance of stealth, the value of ambush over assault, the idea that a 5-man patrol moving silently could accomplish more than a company crashing through undergrowth with helicopter support. The AATTV became Australia's most decorated unit of the entire war. Its members earned all 4 Victoria Crosses awarded to Australians during the conflict. These advisors worked with regular South Vietnamese Army units, with Montagnard Hill tribes alongside American Special Forces, and in some cases with the controversial Phoenix program run by the CIA. They operated as individuals or in small groups of 2 or 3, often in conditions of extreme danger and isolation, relying on their own judgment and the skills they had honed in previous campaigns. Relationships between Australian and American advisors were generally cordial, but there were sometimes significant differences of opinion on the training and tactics that should be employed. When Colonel Sarong expressed doubt about the value of the Strategic Hamlet Program at a U.S. counterinsurgency meeting in Washington in May 1963, he drew a violent challenge from U.S. Marine General Victor Krulak. The Australians were not there to agree. They were there to offer expertise earned in jungles the Americans had never entered. When the first Australian task force established itself in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966, the tactical philosophy they brought was fundamentally alien to their American allies. Australian patrols moved in platoon or squad strength, where Americans moved in company or battalion formation. Australian soldiers avoided jungle tracks and clearings, picking their way through bamboo thickets and tangled foliage with agonizing slowness. Journalist Gerald Stone, reporting from the field in 1966, described the frustration of trekking through the jungle with Australians. Patrols took as long as 9 hours to sweep a single mile of terrain. They moved forward a few steps at a time, stopped, listened, and proceeded again. Where American troops crashed through undergrowth, snapping branches and disturbing wildlife, Australians moved with such discipline that the jungle soundscape remained undisturbed. Birds kept singing. Insects maintained their rhythms. Monkeys continued their calls. To any Viet Cong listening post, the area where an Australian patrol operated sounded exactly like empty jungle. There was nothing to report, nothing to investigate, nothing to ambush. The first Australian task force's approach to the population was equally distinct. Rather than destroying villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong, the Australians searched them carefully, aiming to eventually convert rather than alienate the inhabitants. This was counterinsurgency, as the British had practiced it in Malaya. Separate the guerrilla from the population. Win trust through restraint. Deny the enemy his base of support, not through firepower, but through presence and patience. American commanders, measuring success by body counts and territory cleared, found this approach baffling. General William Westmoreland, commanding all American forces in Vietnam, was not impressed. He complained to Major General Tim Vincent, commander of Australian Forces Vietnam, that the first Australian task force was not being aggressive enough. During a visit to the Australian base in January 1967, Westmoreland labeled the Australian approach as very inactive. He wanted more sweeps, more contacts, more kills on the daily reports. The Australian battalion commanders, who held the body count in open contempt as a measure of success, listened politely and continued doing what they knew worked, but the results told a different story. Within the Special Air Service Regiment, the numbers were staggering. Over a 6-year deployment, the SASR conducted nearly 1,200 combat patrols. They confirmed 492 enemy killed, with another 106 possibly killed. They wounded 47, possibly wounded 10 more, and captured 11 prisoners. Their own losses were almost incomprehensible for a unit engaged in sustained combat operations. 1 killed in action. 1 died of wounds. 3 accidentally killed. 1 missing. 1 death from illness. 28 wounded. Out of 580 men who served in the SASR in Vietnam, only 2 died from enemy action. The kill ratio was the highest of any Australian unit in the war, and by most accounts, the highest of any Allied unit in the entire conflict. The Viet Cong noticed, captured documents and post-war interviews revealed that enemy forces had developed entirely separate tactical guidance for engaging Australians versus Americans. For Americans, the instructions emphasized aggressive ambush at prepared positions, maximum casualties in the opening seconds, and withdrawal before artillery support arrived. The pattern was predictable because American behavior was predictable. For Australians, the guidance was different in a way that spoke volumes. Avoidance was the recommended approach. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush, because the Australians were more likely to detect the ambush before walking into it. Do not pursue, because Australian counterattacking capabilities made such efforts futile. If contact was unavoidable, break it off immediately and withdraw to areas where Australian patrols were not operating. The Viet Cong had a name for Australian soldiers. They called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, phantoms. The term carried supernatural weight in Vietnamese culture beyond ordinary military respect. It meant the Australians had become something the enemy could not see, could not track, could not understand. And the fear was measurable. Enemy activity in Phuoc Tuy province, where Australians concentrated, was consistently lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively engaged Americans in one area flatly refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. David Hackworth understood what this meant because he was one of the few American officers willing to learn from it. While the Pentagon dismissed Australian methods as suited only for small-scale operations in a minor province, Hackworth saw the fundamental truth. The Australians had solved the problem. They had figured out how to fight an enemy who owned the jungle by becoming part of the jungle themselves. The transformation of the Hardcore Battalion reflected this understanding. Hackworth's company commanders returned from their training with Australian infantry units carrying lessons that no American school was teaching. They learned that a squad-sized element making contact and calling in reinforcements was more effective than a company blundering into a firefight. They learned that the ambush was the supreme tactic of jungle warfare, not the assault. They learned that knowing your area of operations intimately, every stream, every trail, every village, gave you an advantage no amount of technology could replicate. Hackworth drove his men relentlessly, but according to a new logic. There would be no more walking down trails where every footstep might trigger a mine. There would be no more daylight movements that invited ambush. The battalion would move at night, using streams and waterways to avoid mined trails. They would set their own ambushes instead of walking into the enemy's. They would learn the Delta's terrain so thoroughly that they could navigate it in darkness by instinct. They would think like guerrillas, fight like guerrillas, and beat the guerrillas at their own game. The helicopter, that symbol of American technological supremacy in Vietnam, was not abandoned, but reimagined. Hackworth treated it as a vehicle to move men into battle, not as the battle itself. Little dependence was placed on the sophisticated machinery of modern warfare. Instead, surprise, deception, mobility, imagination, cunning, and familiarity with the operating area became the defining characteristics of the battalion's tactics. The men learned to move with stealth and ease at night. When they struck hard, and from positions the enemy never expected. From January to late May 1969, the Hardcore Battalion killed over 2,700 enemy soldiers while losing 26 of its own. The western portion of Din Tuong Province, which had been Viet Cong heartland, was made secure. An average of 8 Viet Cong infrastructure members rallied to the government side each week. The enemy's main force units were shattered. For one brief, shining moment, in one small corner of Vietnam, the American military was winning the kind of war it was actually fighting rather than the war it wished it was fighting, and the catalyst for all of it was an American colonel who had been willing to learn from Australians. But the institution was not willing to learn. That was the tragedy Hackworth carried with him for the rest of his life. In early 1971, he was promoted to full colonel and offered the chance to attend the Army War College, a clear signal that he was being groomed for general officer rank. The stars were within reach. A lifetime of combat, of sacrifice, of brilliance on the battlefield was about to pay its ultimate professional dividend. He turned it down, not because he didn't want the stars, because he could no longer pretend that the war was being fought correctly. Because the lessons of the Hardcore Battalion, the lessons of the Australians, the lessons written in blood across a decade of failed operations were being systematically ignored by an officer corps more concerned with career advancement than combat effectiveness. Because the body count remained the measure of success, even though it measured nothing useful. Because good soldiers were dying for bad doctrine, and nobody with rank was willing to say so. On June 27, 1971, ABC aired the interview on its program, Issues and Answers. The footage had been filmed in South Vietnam 2 months earlier. Hackworth, in full-dress uniform, looked into the camera and delivered an assessment that contradicted everything the Pentagon, the White House, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were telling the American public. The war could not be won. The training was inadequate. The officers did not understand guerrilla warfare. The North Vietnamese flag would fly over Saigon within 4 years. Every senior military official in Washington was saying the opposite. Every optimistic briefing, every carefully managed press conference, every statistical report showing progress was a fiction. Hackworth knew it. He had spent 5 years watching it. And now, on national television, he was saying what no officer of his rank had dared to say. The prediction about Saigon falling within 4 years turned out to be more accurate than anything coming from any official source in the American government. The city fell on April 30th, 1975, almost exactly 4 years after Hackworth spoke. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, who had promised progress and eventual victory, were wrong. The colonel who had destroyed his career to tell the truth was right. The Army's response was swift and punishing. An Inspector General's report declared Hackworth derelict in his duties and accused him of acting without honor. Allegations surfaced about personal conduct during his command, including running a brothel and gambling operations in his area. Some of the charges had basis in fact. Hackworth had always operated on the fringes of military regulations, bending rules he considered foolish and ignoring protocols he found counterproductive. Other allegations appeared calculated to discredit a man whose public statements embarrassed the institution. General Abrams and other senior officers moved to court-martial him. Eventually, they allowed him to resign with an honorable discharge, recognizing that prosecuting the most decorated officer in Vietnam would generate exactly the kind of publicity the Pentagon wanted to avoid. Hackworth threw away his medals, he left the country, and he moved to Australia. The choice of destination was not coincidental. Hackworth settled on the Gold Coast near Brisbane, as far from Washington as he could get, and still speak English. He bought gas stations, invested in real estate, and opened a restaurant called Scaramouche that became popular with the local community. He became active in Australia's anti-nuclear movement and was eventually presented the United Nations Medal for Peace. He told people he considered the Combat Infantryman Badge and the UN Peace Medal the two most significant honors of his life, a strange pairing that perfectly captured the contradiction of a man who had spent decades mastering the art of war and then dedicated himself to preventing its most catastrophic form. Living in Australia changed Hackworth in ways that Vietnam alone had not. For the first time since his teenage enlistment, he existed outside the American military ecosystem, outside the culture of institutional loyalty that made criticism synonymous with betrayal. He could look at his own country's military from the outside, the way the Australians had always seen it. The view was sobering. The American military that Hackworth had loved since boyhood, the institution that had raised him from orphan private to legendary colonel, was in many ways its own worst enemy. Its strengths, industrial power, technological sophistication, vast resources, had become liabilities in a conflict that demanded their opposites. And the institutional arrogance that refused to learn from a smaller ally's success had cost not just the war, but tens of thousands of individual lives that better methods might have saved. But beneath the surface of this reinvention, the war never left him. Living in Australia gave him proximity to the men whose methods he had admired across the jungles of Vietnam. He spoke with former SAS operators. He studied their institutional culture, the way selection emphasized psychological characteristics over physical prowess, the way training lasted 18 months instead of the American 6, the way Aboriginal tracking traditions had been woven into operational doctrine through decades of collaboration that no other Western military had attempted. He deepened his understanding of why Australian small unit tactics had produced results that American large unit operations could not match. And he started writing. His 1989 memoir, About Face, The Odyssey of an American Warrior, became a national bestseller and was described by the New York Times as everything a 20th-century war memoir could possibly be. The book was a passionate, brutal accounting of 3 wars' worth of experience, and woven through its pages was a consistent thread of admiration for Australian military professionalism. Hackworth described Australian methods with the precision of a tactician and the passion of a convert. He wrote about how the Australians used squads to make contact and brought in reinforcements to do the killing. He wrote about how they planned operations with the belief that a platoon on the battlefield could accomplish anything. He wrote about the fundamental difference in philosophy. Americans sought to overwhelm the enemy with mass and firepower. Australians sought to outthink, outpatience, and outfight the enemy at the individual and small unit level. The quote that circulated most widely through military history circles captured his assessment with brutal simplicity. The Australians were more patient than the Americans, better guerrilla fighters, better at ambushes. This was not faint praise from a casual observer. This was the judgment of a man who had earned 2 distinguished service crosses, who had built the most effective counterinsurgency battalion of the war, who had spent more time in combat than almost any officer of his generation. When Hackworth said the Australians were better, the weight of that statement was enormous. He wasn't guessing. He had measured it in the only currency that mattered: results on the ground, men who came home alive, enemy forces that fled rather than fight. What made Hackworth's public crediting of Australian methods so significant was the context in which it occurred. The American military establishment had spent years minimizing or ignoring the Australian contribution. General Westmoreland, despite his private complaints about Australian aggressiveness, eventually described them in his memoir, A Soldier Reports, as the most thoroughly professional foreign force serving in Vietnam. He even compared them to the post-Versailles German army, in which even men in the ranks might have been leaders in a less capable force. But this was a carefully calibrated compliment, acknowledging quality while implying limited scope. The Australians were excellent at what they did, the compliment suggested, but what they did was small and peripheral to the main American effort. The irony was suffocating. Westmoreland praised Australian professionalism while simultaneously refusing to adopt the methods that professionalism had produced. He compared them to the elite Reichswehr while insisting that American mass production warfare was the only viable strategy. It was as if a general had praised the world's finest swordsman while maintaining that the only proper weapon was a blunderbuss. The compliment acknowledged the skill. The doctrine ignored the lesson. Other American officers who served alongside Australians came away with similar impressions, but fewer institutional constraints on expressing them. Journalist Neil Davis, who covered the war for a decade, noted that the Australians were very professional, very well trained, and fought the people they were sent to fight while trying not to involve civilians. This last point was critical. Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy produced far fewer civilian casualties than comparable American operations in adjacent provinces, which had profound implications for the political dimension of the war that American doctrine largely ignored. Hackworth rejected the Westmoreland framing entirely. He argued that what the Australians did was not peripheral, it was the answer. The methods they employed, the patience, the fieldcraft, the psychological manipulation, the integration of indigenous tracking knowledge, these were not interesting curiosities from a minor ally. They were the solution to the problem that American doctrine could not solve, and the American military's refusal to adopt those methods had cost thousands of lives. This argument gained additional force when the post-war reassessment began. Former Viet Cong leaders who spoke openly after reunification confirmed what captured documents had suggested during the war. The Australians were worse than the Americans, not in moral terms, but in tactical effectiveness. One Viet Cong leader offered a comparison that Hackworth would have appreciated. The American style was to make contact, then call for planes and artillery. The Viet Cong response was to break contact and disappear. But the Australians were more patient, better at guerrilla warfare, better at ambushes. They could not be evaded the same way because they did not announce their presence the same way. Hackworth returned to the United States in the late 1980s when his medals were reissued and his memoir was climbing bestseller lists. He married Ailhis England, who became his writing partner and intellectual companion. From 1990 to 1996, he served as Newsweek's contributing editor for defense, covering the Gulf War, Somalia, the Balkans, and every other conflict that came along. He used each assignment as an opportunity to hammer the same themes. The American military had not learned the lessons of Vietnam. The same institutional arrogance that had produced failure in Southeast Asia was producing failure in new theaters, and the solutions remained available for anyone willing to study what the Australians had demonstrated decades earlier. His syndicated column, Defending America, distributed by King Features, appeared in newspapers across the country. Week after week, he returned to the principles that the Hardcore Battalion had proved and that Australian SAS patrols had pioneered. Small units, stealth, patience, cultural adaptation, respect for the enemy, intelligence gathered through fieldcraft rather than technology, the primacy of the individual soldier's judgment over centralized command. When the War on Terror began after September 11, 2001, Hackworth saw the same patterns repeating. He wrote extensively about Afghanistan and Iraq, warning that conventional American military doctrine was once again failing to adapt to unconventional warfare. He pointed out that the Special Operations community, which had by then incorporated many of the lessons Australian SAS operators had demonstrated in Vietnam, was achieving results that conventional forces could not. Delta Force, the expanded SEAL teams, the entire apparatus of American unconventional warfare, had absorbed principles that were available for learning in 1966. It had just taken decades for the institution to accept what Hackworth and the Australians had been saying all along. His final book, Steal My Soldiers' Hearts, published in 2002, returned to the story of the Hardcore Battalion and spelled out explicitly what he had implied throughout his career. The transformation of the 4th Battalion, 39th Infantry, from the Army's worst unit to its most effective, was not the product of American doctrine. It was the product of an American commander willing to learn from Australian methods and apply them with American resources. The company commanders he sent to train with Australian infantry learned the art of the ambush, the discipline of patient patrolling, the tactical value of fighting like a guerrilla rather than a conventional soldier. They brought those lessons back, and the battalion was reborn. David Hackworth died on May 4, 2005, in Tijuana, Mexico, where he was seeking treatment for bladder cancer, a disease appearing with grim frequency among Vietnam veterans exposed to the defoliants Agent Orange and Agent Blue. He was 74 years old. His wife was beside him. His last words to his doctor were a message for Eilis. "If I die, tell her I was grateful for every moment she bought me, every extra moment I got to spend with her. Tell her my greatest achievement is the love the two of us shared." On his deathbed, he asked Eilis to carry on the crusade to help the soldiers who suffer most from silent trauma. Even in his final hours, the orphan boy who had found his family in the Army was thinking about the soldiers. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The mourners included men from the Hardcore Battalion who had traveled from across the country to stand beside the grave of the colonel who had saved their lives by ignoring the rules and listening to the Australians. 30 years later, these men, now grown old, still spoke of Hackworth with a reverence that bordered on devotion. He had taken the Army's worst battalion and made it the best not through brutality or blind discipline, but through intelligence, through willingness to learn, through the revolutionary act of admitting that someone else, someone from a smaller country with fewer resources and less prestige, had figured out what the mighty American military could not. His decorations told their own story. 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 10 Silver Stars, 4 Legions of Merit, a Distinguished Flying Cross, 8 Bronze Stars, 8 Purple Hearts, 34 Air Medals, 4 Army Commendation Medals. 65 of his awards were for valor. He had been nominated for the Medal of Honor 3 times. The Philadelphia Inquirer called him the best soldier of his generation. General Hal Moore, co-author of We Were Soldiers Once and Young, called Hackworth the Patton of Vietnam. The novelist Ward Just, who had known him for 40 years, called him the genuine article, a soldier's soldier, a connoisseur of combat. Nicholas Prophet described his memoir as a passionate cry from the heart of a man who never stopped loving the Army, even when it stopped loving him back. But perhaps the most fitting tribute was the one Hackworth had written himself, in dozens of articles and books and interviews over 3 decades. The tribute he paid to the men whose methods he had championed, whose tactical genius he had recognized when no one else in the American military establishment was willing to see it. The Australians fought the war the right way. They moved slowly because speed was fatal. They abandoned hygiene because cleanliness was a detectable liability. They modified their weapons because survival mattered more than specifications. They respected their enemy because contempt was a killer. They used Aboriginal tracking traditions refined over 40,000 years because no modern technology could replicate what those traditions offered. And they achieved results that the most powerful military in history could not match. Hackworth saw all of this. He learned from it. He tried to teach it. And when the institution refused to listen, he burned his career to the ground rather than stay silent. He moved to the country whose soldiers had earned his respect and spent the rest of his life telling the world what he had witnessed. One killed in action out of 580 men who served. Nearly 1,200 patrols across 6 years of sustained operations. The highest kill ratio of any Allied unit in the war. The enemy so afraid they issued standing orders to avoid contact. They earned that. 3 words from the most decorated colonel in the American Army. 3 words that cost him his career, his country, and nearly everything he had. 3 words that acknowledged what the Pentagon spent decades trying to classify, suppress, and forget. The Australians were better. Not because they were braver, not because they were stronger, because they were smarter, because they listened to the jungle instead of trying to shout over it, because they became what the environment demanded, rather than insisting the environment accommodate what they preferred to be. David Hackworth understood this. He proved it with the Hardcore Battalion. He spent 30 years writing about it, and when he died, the lesson he left behind was not about Australian tactics or American failures. It was about something simpler and more painful. The truth does not care about your rank. It does not care about your budget. It does not care about your institutional pride. It sits in the jungle and waits for you to notice it. The Australians noticed it in 1966. Hackworth noticed it in 1969. The American military took decades longer, and every year of delay was measured in names added to a black granite wall in Washington, D.C. They earned that. The phantoms of the jungle, the soldiers who were dismissed as primitives until they proved themselves masters, the ghosts who taught America's most dangerous warrior that everything he knew about war was wrong, that is their legacy. That is what Hackworth spent his life defending. That is what he gave up everything to say. And the question remains, as it has remained for over 50 years, whether the institutions that most need to hear it will ever truly listen. The Australians answered that question in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province. David Hackworth answered it on national television. The Pentagon is still working on its reply.